Order. Can I welcome members and witnesses to our oral evidence session in public this morning. This is the Education Select Committee's first oral evidence session in our inquiry on further education and skills. Can I first of all invite our witnesses to introduce yourselves to us, perhaps starting with Robert at the end there.
Yes, good morning. My name's Rob Nitsch. I'm the Chief Executive of the Federation of Awarding Bodies. We're the trade body for organisations that write qualifications and assess them in FE and skills. I'm also the chair at the City of Portsmouth College, and until August of last year I was the Chief Operating Officer Delivery Director at IFE.
Thank you.
Good morning everybody, Darren Hankey, Principal and Chief Executive of Hartlepool College of Further Education in the wonderful North East. It's my 30th year in further education, 12th year as college principal, and probably the only college principal who was resat at GCSE English, GCSE Maths as a part of their education journey. Thank you for the invite.
Very much.
And hello, I'm Alice Gardner. I'm the Chief Executive of the Edge Foundation. We're an independent foundation that is interested in young people's journey from 11 through to 24. Our particular focus is ensuring that young people have access to a broad and balanced curriculum and a feel of what it's like to work in the real world. Our research and our policy focuses on largely the aspects between 11 and 19. We're trying to encourage the education system to feel like it can challenge the status quo.
Good morning everyone, I'm David Robinson. I'm the Director of Vulnerable Learners and Post-16 at the Education Policy Institute. We're an independent research organisation.
Thank you very much. So I'll begin our questioning this morning. The written evidence that our committee has received describes the range of post-16 qualifications as narrow, rigid and failing to accommodate the diverse learning needs of all students. What is your assessment of the range of post-16 qualifications currently on offer and how could it be improved? I might start first of all with Robert as your member organisations are the awarding body for those qualifications.
Thank you. I think the range is incredibly important, and I think that the members would advocate for a broad-based, purpose-driven offer. I think that we're not doing as well on the broad base and we're not doing as well on the purpose-driven offer, and I think it would have been helpful if that had come through a bit more strongly in the curriculum and assessment review and where it's planning to look. So we would be advocating for those things, but also, not leaving behind the idea of quality. And actually, we need to make sure that breadth and doesn't come at the cost of it just introducing low quality qualifications.
Darren.
Yeah, I think on a positive, I think we've got a clear qualification framework in England, going from entry level all the way up to master's degree level and PhD. Some aspects of that are very, very clear. So the so-called academic route, I think that's quite clear. And if someone wants to be a doctor or a vet, I think it's very clear to that young person, their parents, their carers, etc., what they need to do in terms of GCSEs, A-levels in university. When it comes to vocational and technical education, I think to echo what Rob said, I think we've got a very broad range of qualifications there. I think one of the differences with vocational and technical education compared to the more academic route is that we tend to call them by their awarding organisation name and number, and that can, for those in the system, it sort of makes sense and it's quite clear, but for those outside the system, it's probably lacks a little bit of clarity. So young people coming through, adults returning, parents and carers and employers. I think as I'm 30 years in the sector this year, there's been constant tinkering in that 30 years. We've had an alphabet soup of different sort of qualifications, and even just recently we've obviously at level 3 there was going to be a direction of travel of A-levels, T-levels and apprenticeships. Shortly after that we then had the announcement of the Advanced British Standard. We had a change of government who announced a rapid review. That probably could have been a little bit quicker because we went into this academic year not really knowing what we were going to deliver next academic year, and that was a difficult message to share with next year's students and their parents and carers and also adults. And then obviously we've got the curriculum and assessment review as well. So So I think there is an opportunity there to be a little bit clearer. Again, when it comes to adult education, I think devolution has had a bit of an impact on that as well. So Hartlepool is in the Tees Valley, but we do serve people in County Durham, which is a different area when it comes to devolution, and they both have different priorities, different entitlements, and again, that can be sort of quite confusing as well.
Thank you. Alice?
I think the landscape can look quite confusing to a young person post-16. I think some of that is a responsibility pre-16, so it's really difficult to look at it in isolation. So I think it's quite clear that young people are starting to think about where their lives are going to take them really young. Sometimes 9 and 10, they're disregarding career paths. And then all the way through to 16, we've got quite a narrow curriculum that doesn't encourage young people to really understand the routes and the pathways that might be available to them later. And if we're interested in them taking a pathway post-16 that's more vocational or technical, how are they going to know and understand what those choices look like if pre-16 the curriculum is very tight and doesn't allow the flexibility to be studying those sorts of subjects that might set them up post-16. So I'm thinking about things like design and technology, which we've seen a rapid decline at GCSE, which kind of engenders those skills around problem solving and resilience and teamwork, all the things we hear employers talking about all the time. So I think the landscape looks pretty confusing. It's also not a one-stop shop. Once you go to post-16, you don't have that same opportunity at 18 just to use like a UCAS system to be able to find or source an apprenticeship. You have to kind of be quite self-reliant either on the teaching staff or your parents, or you have to be really independent and get out there and do it yourself. But that's not easy. And worryingly, those apprenticeships that are coming from the lower socioeconomic backgrounds struggle to get support on their applications at all when they're making apprenticeship applications, which is a worry because those are the ones that need the most support to make sure they're making good choices.
Thank you. David?
Thank you. So building on what some of my colleagues here have already said, I think we have a clear distinction between academic pathways, which we have a single recognisable brand, versus technical vocational qualifications, where we have many, many awarding bodies, many different sizes of qualifications. In fact, there are 3 times as many qualifications within each subject area for vocational qualifications compared to academic qualifications. I think this complexity works against those who need most support at that post-16 transition. We know that disadvantaged learners taking lower level qualifications tend to be less well informed about their options at this transition, and this can often result in disadvantaged learners undermatching into qualifications. They tend to take qualifications where their peers are less able than them on average, and also taking qualifications that on average lead to less well-earning careers. So I think that complexity for, as I said, disadvantaged and young people taking lower level qualifications can work against those who need most support. I think the way forward here is actually to continue to simplify the qualification market post-16, particularly in the technical vocational area.
Thank you. So I just want to push a little bit on that question. So you've articulated the issue very clearly, which is a sort of imbalance between the clarity for the academic route and the communication that students get around that, and then the kind of wild west of kind of how you navigate the range of vocational pathways. So my question would be, how are there obvious interventions that could be made to make the range of pathways clearer? And David, you've mentioned kind of essentially sort of slimming down the number of routes, but we've also heard evidence on the need for a kind of very broad base of qualifications and a diverse range of options. So I'm sort of interested as to whether there are interventions that could be delivered that just make that landscape more straightforward to navigate and better supported for students who are pursuing a vocational pathway. Maybe Darren?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, probably alludes to what I said before, really, and picking up on David's point. I think there are a number of awarding organisations that offer GCSE English and A-level English, probably more so than health and social care in the vocational technical sphere. But again, we just know it as GCSE English and A-level English, whereas in vocational technical sphere, it's either City and Guilds, Pearson, BTEC, whatever it may be. So we might touch on T-levels a little bit later, but I quite like the intent of T-levels, because it did bring all of those under just the one banner of calling it a T level. So That's one particular thing that probably could be pursued moving forward in terms of having a more of a strategic approach, a coherent approach, and also having a clearer purpose of what we want from post-16 education, not just for 16, 17, 18-year-olds, but for adults as well, and also apprenticeships.
Yeah. And David, did you want to?
Yeah, so I think, for GCSEs, we have a single brand there with multiple awarding bodies, but those qualifications are quite carefully sort of standardised in terms of assessment, etc. For T-levels, we have a franchise model where we have one awarding body for each sort of subject area. I think we could use either of those models for smaller qualifications, smaller level 3 qualifications. So taking the overall approach of T-levels, of reducing the number of complexity either in terms of the number of awarding bodies or the ranges of types of qualifications, and I think that would be a significant step forward.
You, Robert?
Thank you. I mean, I think the first thing is we need to be really careful that we don't balance the technical, vocational, further education offer just purely against academic qualifications, that, we need to see them for what they are and what they do, and I think there's just a perception that we need to adjust there. In terms of what I think materialistically we could do to help, I think helping students to have a more informed choice, and I think where we do see informed choice, we see better take-up, we see students that stick with the course that they're doing, and I think that is something, again, the Curriculum Assessment Review could look at. This isn't career advice, this is education advice, and I think the two are distinct. I think there's certainly a case for more clarity about the sense of purpose and what the outcomes of technical education are, where they land, and also how they're branded and grouped together. And the final 2 points I'd make is that linking more effectively Key Stage 4 and FE, I think, is critical. When you look at a catering GCSE, that is not based on the same standards that are used to support FE-based qualifications, such as apprenticeships. So there's just an example of the discontinuity as people travel through their education journey, and you just sort of bump into skills and skills and vocational training at 16. We don't smooth the pathway in. And the final point I'd make is that actually we also need to think about the here and now. There's a moratorium on new qualifications, on reviews of qualifications, and I do think that we've got to think about how we deal with that and how we move on from that situation. So there's a longer term issue, how do we shape it, but there's also a short term issue which is affecting students today.
Thank you. Alice, do you want to comment on that?
I think there's some actions we could take quite quickly and quite easily that would really help, especially from the young person's learner journey. I think one of those would be to monitor the compliance of the Baker Clause, to ensure that young people are understanding and hearing from alternative institutions about what could be next post-16, so they're able to make good decisions. I think rewarding strong partnerships between FE and HE and mayoral areas and devolved regions that are doing things that are really neat and working in their regions. I think we could also make more use of the IFE occupational maps, which allow young people to kind of really understand what this qualification they're thinking of looking at is where it's going to take them, what that looks like, and the journey through that. Careers advice and guidance, I mean, we talk about it all the time, but unless that's really strong, unless we start talking about that earlier, then we're kind of shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. And then I mentioned earlier also the one-stop shop in terms of having a place where young people can go that feels like the same as it is when you're on the academic route, that you have one place to go where you understand how to find the opportunities and how to apply. And I think those could be done reasonably easily and quickly.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Serena now.
Thank you, Chair. In December last year, the government announced that it would retain a number of Level 3 qualifications which were previously marked for being defunded, including dozens of BTECs until 2027. What impact will this delayed defunding have on the sector? And in your view, should these qualifications be retained beyond 2027? And I'll start with David.
So I think that it is important that we retain alternatives to T-levels. I think, as I've spoken about with the committee here before, T-levels are very large, challenging qualifications. They have good outcomes associated with it. Those who succeed in a T-level are more likely to progress to higher technical qualifications, apprenticeships, etc. But they are large and challenging. And I think if we give young people a binary choice between T-levels and A-levels on one side or being pushed down to lower level qualifications, then I think many more young people will end up not achieving a level 3, which we know is associated with good outcomes for young people. So I think it's important that we maintain a range of smaller qualifications. Young people have spiky profiles. They may want to take a smaller level 3 qualification in one area and a level 2 qualification in another subject area, or a mix of academic and technical qualifications. So I think it's important that we maintain that mix, so I wouldn't want to defund too many alternatives to T-levels.
Thank you. Alice?
I think David makes some very good points there. It's really important there are alternatives. I mean, T-levels are the equivalent of 3 A-levels. They're pretty chunky. They don't suit all learners. We already know that a number of institutions are kind of doing that entry level in, so that year of prep to see if they can get the students up to standard. But it's also important to think about where young people go when they take that range of qualifications, and a lot are still going to university that take BTECs, and retention at university is good for a majority of BTEC students. It's also important, as David said, to have that flex, and it kind of appeals to that side of me that thinks that a baccalaureate style teaching from 16 through to 18 or 19 really supports that, the opportunity to mix and match between the tracks. So rather than talking about a parity of esteem between academic and technical and vocational, it's actually the opportunity for all young people, whatever their backgrounds or aspirations, that they can actually mix and match those qualifications to give them a suite that really helps them be prepared for the world of work. And interestingly, we did some polling last year, and 78% of the 1,000 that were polled believed that that kind of mix and match option was a really good way of preparing young people for the world of work. So I think there's something in there, I think.
And Darren, particularly with your experience in terms of the impact on staff and students and parents?
I think the decision was welcome. From an operational point of view, I just wish it was a little bit quicker, because I think we found out just before Christmas, and I say when we started this academic year we knew what the curriculum was. There was an immediate pause when the current government came in, but then that rapid review, we didn't get the results of that until later on in the year. But obviously for the next academic year, we're having open days, colleges up and down the country trying to inform current year 11, their parents, their carers, of what the options were. And obviously we went into that process a little bit blind. Probably just to echo what everyone else has said, I think for me these type of qualifications are essential. I think if we go with A-levels, T-levels and apprenticeships, that will cut off a lot of opportunities for lots of young people. As we've seen with T-levels, as I said before, I like the intent behind it. But the take-up has been variable. I think dropouts have been variable. Probably arguably the most successful one is in early years, but that had a successful predecessor. That sort of sector had or those qualifications had a long, well-established track record of getting young people into placements, which the T-levels done. The industry placements are a concern. They're a concern, I think, with healthcare across most colleges. If I can just give it a bit more of an example with T-level engineering in the Tees Valley, which is Hartlepool, Middlesbrough, Stockton, Redcart and Darlington. I would say those 5 FE colleges in there, we've probably got about 500 young people doing level 3 non-T-level engineering qualifications. That's aerospace engineering, automotive engineering, civil engineering, electrical, mechanical, mechatronics. There is no way that we will be able to find 500 placements for those students if we went down the A-level, T-level apprenticeship route. No way in this world. So the question is, what happens to those young people in those places like the Tees Valley, where so it's a wonderful part of the country, it's got lots of bright spots, but the economy is probably not as rich and as buoyant to support the placement. So I think from my point of view, I like the intent behind T-levels, A-levels, they're well established. We do need another alternative as well.
Okay, thank you. And Robert?
Yeah, our members who deliver T-levels have made a huge investment in T-levels, the return from which has nowhere near been realised. But I think the vision of it being the preeminent offer at level 3 in the technical space is simply not supported by the number of students that are taking it up, which I think is 3% of the population. So we would advocate for a broader offer that caters across the ability range, and also for us to really think about the format, the flexibility, the purpose of T-levels, and perhaps walk away or have more flexibility in a model. Currently it's a sort of one model fits all, and it's astonishing to think that you could have a single education model that works across the whole breadth of our economy. So we would like to see more flexibility and agility built into the T-level model to help that thrive alongside a broader offer.
Okay, thank you. And to the panel, again, we have seen evidence that post-16 vocational options are not often presented to students on an equal footing with academic choices such as A-levels. How can the parity of esteem between academic and vocational pathways be achieved? And I'll start again with David.
So I sometimes worry that parity of esteem is a distraction. I think even in countries with very well-developed technical vocational systems, around the same proportion of adults there would recommend vocational pathways for young people as would in the UK. I would rather that we focus on things like parity of inputs, and we know that those aren't equal across academic and technical pathways. So, we've already made some moves in recent years as far as this is concerned. It used to be the case that technical qualifications were funded less than academic qualifications, despite the fact they have higher delivery costs. That has been improved in recent years. But as I said, we still have other inequalities across those pathways. We've talked about the complexity of the pathways and the difficulties that creates for young people. We also know that academic pathways are often taught in school sixth forms. Technical vocational pathways more often than not taught in further education colleges, where pay is on average 18% lower. And that has direct impact on recruitment and retention in those sectors. So vacancy rates in the FE sector are around 10 times those that they are in the school sector. So I would rather we focus on parity of inputs. We may get closer to parity of esteem if we address some of those things. But I think parity of esteem on its own, I think, can be a distraction.
Thank you. And Alice?
I think Dave makes a very good point there, because I think that we need to start seeing these qualifications as something that actually are enablers for all, because actually they very often engender all the skills that employers are looking for. So it doesn't matter if you're thinking of studying French at university, you still need to know how to be able to work in a team, you still need resilience, you still need all the skills that are going to prepare you for the world of work. So rather than thinking about these being for these people and these being for those people, actually it's that mix and match, it's that landscape of actually these subjects are good for all, so that we stop defining them as those are for the less able, or those are for the people who are in socially and economically deprived areas, and these are for the leafy areas that are going to do really well. So I think if we stop thinking about those subjects in those terms, that will really help. I probably sound like a broken record, but it all happens earlier. We really need to start talking about this when young people are 11 or even younger, thinking about what is going to happen as they move through school. I mean, school is a great place to be able to enjoy education, the love of learning. This is all marvellous, but it really matters that young people have an idea of what the purpose of education is for and how they get a good job that is meaningful for them, that is going to embed them in their community and gives them a stake in society. And if we don't start talking about that earlier, by the time they get to 16, they're really confused about what the options are. If you're going on an academic route, that's much easier. But if you're thinking about going down the technical route, you may never have studied a technical subject ever. You may never have been in a work environment like engineering, for example. You may never have done a work placement. So we need to roll it all back and start really early so that we're preparing young people for those choices, so that it isn't a cliff edge when they get to 16.
Thank you, Alice. Darren?
Yeah, I think it's a bit... pick up on the points of a parity of esteem there, and obviously I've mentioned the so-called academic routes. In some respects I don't really get it. So to be a successful engineer, you really need a good knowledge of physics, you need a good knowledge of maths. To work in the healthcare sector, you need a good knowledge of biology, physiology, even some courses which I don't necessarily agree with, but often are much derided. Hair and beauty, you need the anatomy and physiology of the hand and the head, and dermatology and that sort of type of stuff. So to be successful in a vocational area, a technical area, you need a good academic underpinning anyway. So going back to previous conversation, we could probably call all qualifications at level 2 and level 3 the same thing, because that would do away with the parity. I think another aspect, building on what Alice says, is and certainly a case in Hartlepool and the Tees Valley in the North East is, look at what money you can earn. If you can lay 1,000 bricks a day accurately, you're earning £50,000-60,000. Similarly, if you're an electrician, we've seen jobs recently for pipe fitters for £100,000. So that's been a real boon for those of us who offer vocational and technical qualifications, because the labour market's there. The labour market's crying out for people. We've got an ageing workforce in the North East, and lots of the firms who engage with colleges are looking for young people and adults returning to try and fill the gaps that they've got in an ageing workforce. Similarly, I think we are seeing it a little bit now, where going to university isn't probably the golden ticket that it was for myself and other people on the panel when we went a few years ago. Or many years ago, I should say, in my case. And there's lots of data coming through there now that's actually taking a vocational qualification, a technical qualification, especially at the higher level, HNC, HND, which are very, very popular in the North East, as well as other areas across the country. They can actually provide a better economic return than the more academic route.
I would agree with my colleagues. I think it's a perception rooted in the academic route. And there seems to be a preconceived idea that non-academic just needs to catch up. In terms of how we might think about that, I completely agree, a greater focus on a sense of purpose in education and what the outcomes are, rather than education for education's purposes, education for a purpose. And I think that might help motivate more people to stay in education and see it as an outcome-based activity. I definitely think the Baker Clause is not working. It's not sufficient. Where we do see it applied, it seems to work reasonably well. 16% more apprenticeships in school settings that actually push that. So I think we really need to think about the Baker Clause and how that is applied. I would certainly agree we need to think about it earlier in schools, but I would also think about the technical routes into teaching. Teaching remains a very degree-focused profession. I'm not disagreeing with that at all, but you don't need to go to university to acquire a degree, as we see in degree apprenticeships. So I think when we think about how we condition the system to better support it, it's not just what's done in schools, it's the type of people who are the mentors, the leaders, and are setting the examples in those schools as well. So it needs to be a cultural change rather than a sort of something a bit more fragile, so to speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. For some post-16 students with special educational needs or disabilities, learning how to live independent, well-connected lives is as important as preparing for employment. What specific actions should the government take to ensure post-16 education is inclusive and meets the needs of all learners and trainees? And I'll start with Darren.
Yeah, I think further education is probably the most inclusive sector that we've got out of primary, secondary and higher education. It's a wonderful and diverse sector in terms of their levels, so from entry level all the way up through to master's degree, lots of colleges offer. And obviously lots of different sort of types of colleges. We do serve students from disadvantaged backgrounds. I think all colleges, certainly with my college, we have seen more and more students come through with EHCP over the last sort of few years. I think we do, and all colleges do, a wonderful job in supporting those learners. I think there is an issue with some learners who have yet to have a diagnosis, and I think we've seen this in the school system. It's certainly the case in further education, where some learners certainly present as having some kind of need, but they've got no diagnosis to back that up. That then puts pressure on the college, because obviously with those who do have a plan, that there is a bit of extra support there to make sure that those learners get the support they need to be successful within the further education setting. But obviously those who have not got a diagnosis, that if they've not got that support, then we just got to rely on the investment that comes in, the standard investment that comes in. Just on investment, at this moment in time, I'm sure David might mention his organisation has done some research. The Institute of Fiscal Studies highlights that current investment to 16, 17 and 18-year-olds is 10% less now, 24, 25, than it was back in 2010. So we've gone back 15 years, we've gone backwards in investment. What that means in real terms, and again it's particularly important for those we send, but for all learners, is that we get paid to deliver a programme of study for 580 hours. That is about 2/3 of what the average OECD young person will get, and some of the high-performing OECD countries, your Germany's, your Singapore's, your Scandinavian countries, that will be about half what they get. So in many respects, we're letting down young people, not necessarily those with SEND, but also just normal young people we're letting down. So obviously those who come through who do not have a diagnosis, we then have to try and support them out of that investment that we've got. That's sort of quite difficult. The free school meals investment that we get, that's about £2.53 to help feed a growing teenager. And then, those whose child benefit and other support, they might get a universal credit. That's not going up in line with inflation. So there is a lot of demand and pressure on colleges to support those students, not only with the HCPs, but those who don't have them, to try and get them where they want to get to. But going back to my previous point, it's a wonderful, vibrant sector. Students come there, they want to learn, develop, improve and get better and prepare them for the next steps. And colleges do a good job of doing that despite the problems that we face in terms of investment.
Yeah, Alice?
I think we've covered a couple of points that I think are quite relevant here, which is around choice and thinking about subjects like BTECs and thinking about how you can kind of pull subjects together to offer really good choice for SEND students. And so that's another reason why I wouldn't want to have a dichotomy of A levels and T levels, because it doesn't offer that breadth that those young people might thrive on. I think also we need to think about teaching, because the more vibrant the teaching is, the more applied it is, the more relevant it is, the easier it is actually for all young people to engage. And I think that's the interesting thing about SEND, is that there obviously are specialist interventions that really help those young people, but a lot of those interventions would actually help the whole young person population, because being able to have learning that feels real, that takes them onto that the idea of what they'll do in the workplace, that makes that learning come alive, it makes them feel invested in what they're doing. That isn't just good for those students that have SEND, that's good for the whole population. And I think good also for lecturers and teachers, because teaching in that way, which initially takes quite a lot of effort to pull together, once you're engaging your students, then it really helps with their concentration. It means that you have less issues around school refusers, if they feel that actually when they go to school, this is a place for them. It's a place for them, it's a place that's invested in them, and that there's a product at the end of it for them, rather than something they have to do because this is what you do between like 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. because what else do you do? So I think it's trying to give that stake. The Edge Foundation isn't a specialist in the area of SEND, so that's probably the end of my piece on that.
Thank you. David?
Thank you. So first, I think some of what we do know about students with SEND in the 16 to 18 phase is we know that by the end of that phase, they are on average 7 grades, equivalent of 7 A-level grades behind their non-SEND peers for young people with EHCPs. For those who were on SEND support previously, they're around 4 grades behind by the end of the phase. I don't think we fully understand what happens for SEND students with SEND in this phase. I think there's a bit of a dearth of research and good evidence on the drivers for some of those gaps. Certainly something we're keen at EPI to do more research on to understand some of the drivers there. I think some of what Alice has mentioned in terms of a diversity of different kinds of pathways for young people, and also I think critically the ability for young people to change pathways as they progress through their post-16 education, I think is really, really important. So I don't have too much more to add on SEND, but I do think there's a big evidence gap there that needs filling.
Thank you. I think my colleagues have outlined how the FE and skills model fits, potentially this community extremely well, and I think people who design this type of qualification are fully aware of that. I think there are 2 additional points I'd make. The first one is I think we need to be really careful not to confuse quality or ability with people that might be stigmatised as being SEND, and I think that in the way that we talk about it and we discuss it, that is an unhelpful merging in an atmospheric that may well exist that we need to think really carefully about. So trying to make sure we're clear about what we're talking about is part of a national conversation I think we need to straighten out. The second thing is that the flexibility that there is available with valid forms of assessment. So actually, if you look at what IFATE recognises, it recognised 13 forms of assessment, so much more than just exams. And I don't think we're adventurous enough in exploring the other forms of assessment that may suit individuals that are stigmatised as being SEND better. And have we got the balance right between reliability of assessment and the validity of the assessment, and where do we wish that line to be drawn? And I think we should be looking at that extremely carefully.
That's interesting, because my next question was going to be about the changes needed to be made to the assessment system to make it more inclusive. How would you say that that's best achieved?
I think it's by embracing more a wider forms of assessment, thinking carefully about how they're compared. Actually, if you look at our approach to assessment, we've sort of tried to benchmark everything against exams, or we're moving to that sort of model. You can see that come through in T-levels and the extent of the assessment that sits within a T-level programme. I think we should be putting much more emphasis on comparing different forms of assessment and how something that's more practical can be benchmarked, so actually we're able to value people between different forms of assessment, rather than think that we're heading for reliability and therefore the purest exam model is a much better way of tackling this. And I think that links back to some of the research that was being talked about a few minutes ago.
And Darren, on this issue of assessment, we know that it's been criticised for not accommodating the needs and abilities of all students, including neurodivergent learners. What changes would you like to see in the system?
Yeah, I agree with Rob, really. I think there's a sort of overemphasis on exams, and that's particularly the case in Year 11. I had a daughter through Year 11 last year. She's had 27 exams to get through the GCSE she did last year. Obviously, in further education, certainly in practical areas, there are sort of wider forms, and as other people have said, that can then make people flourish who don't necessarily flourish in the exam situation. I think we've got sort of new technologies now. We did look to pilot something called comparative judgment, with no more marking, a wonderful lady called Daisy Christodoulou and that organisation. So there's those new forms and new bits of technology which could be used to vary it up a bit. I appreciate why exams are sort of lauded. They are probably the best of the bad bunch in terms of reliability and validity, and also being non-discriminatory as well. But I think if we just put all of our eggs in the exams basket, we're missing out on the talents that lots of people have.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Darren now.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. You'll know that the Curriculum and Assessment Review's interim report was published last week, and in there they describe T-levels as the gold standard of vocational qualifications. I'd be interested to hear if you share that view, and what your assessment of T-levels is. Maybe if we mix it up and start at that end and come this way.
Yes, certainly. Thank you. I think it's very dangerous to stigmatise anything as the gold standard. I think any qualification will have advantages and disadvantages. I think T-levels do a particular function. I think our focus should be on how we can make them work better. The original Richard review was an intervention at level 2 and level 3, rather than just level 3. So effectively, rather than we've had an educational intervention, we've invented a new qualification at level 3. The transition programme is not working that well either, so that needs some real focus. I think part of making it work is thinking about the infrastructure or the foundations on that which it sits, rather than just viewing it as a qualification itself. And having said that, I think there's some really good things in the qualification, particularly the industrial placement, and I would draw a distinction between an industrial placement and work experience, and us understanding that and seeing what it's brought to the marketplace. And finally, I'd just take you back to my earlier observation that I think that the model that we're applying to T-levels is very rigid at the moment, and I think it's just a leap of faith to expect that to work across the whole of the economy. So thinking more about the purpose and where a T-level leads you and how it progresses And just picking up on Darren's earlier point, yes, education and childcare does work better than any other T-level. What's remarkable about it is that when we developed that T-level, we thought that it would help teaching assistants rather than teachers itself, and it's now become a major route into primary education. So it also demonstrates that we're finding our way with these qualifications, and there's an element of going with the grain and working with it and thinking about how we can optimise what it's telling us about the type of people that it attracts and where they go.
Thank you.
Yep.
Darren?
Yeah, probably echo what I said before. I probably personally wouldn't describe it as a gold standard, but I like the intent behind it when it first came out. And again, that parity of esteem with T-level, but then also, as I alluded to before, it takes away most vocational and technical qualifications are named after an awarding organisation, some with names, some with numbers, some with brand names, and that just can create a bit of confusion. So it took that away. As I said before, take-up has been variable. Interesting, we mentioned early years, again, that is the most successful one, but again, there's been an unintended consequence there with its predecessor qualification. Some people did go into teaching in primary school and follow that route. A vast majority went into working in nurseries with preschool. Now what we're finding, I think it's national rather than just a thing in the North East, that the vast majority want to go into primary school and don't want to go into nurseries, and I think there's a bit of a workforce development issue in that sector. The industrial placements, again, good intent, but I've said before, some parts of the economy will struggle, so that the North East, the North West, the Midlands, the South West, and what happens if that stays as is? What happens to those young people who live in an area where they can't access a placement? I think there's a bit of research from the CIPD. It was a few years ago, and it was post-COVID, so that might have had an impact. But employer awareness and employers' willingness to engage is probably not where we want it to be. Again, we've touched on assessment in this session. The assessment, obviously there is stuff linked to the industrial placement, but there's by and large exam focus, so it's missing out on other forms of assessment as well. And I think, to echo Rob's point, we just need a clear sort of strategy, purpose, and a bit of coherence to the sort of post-16 landscape, and including adult education as well.
I think we need to acknowledge where the challenges are if we want T-levels to be really successful. And I think if we kind of paper over the cracks, we're doing a disservice to what could be a really useful pathway for young people. And I think Robert and Darren have talked about some of those challenges. I mean, the dropout rates are still quite high. Young people are still slightly unsure when they end up on a T-level how they got there. They haven't necessarily made a highly structured decision about that. I think industry placements, great. I mean, why wouldn't you want to have that kind of engagement with employers? But I think the challenge is with the youth guarantee and apprenticeships as well, we're asking employers to do an awful lot. They're not always clear what those demands are, and if you're like Darren, you've got 500 engineers, that suddenly looks like a huge amount of employers you've got to pull out of a proverbial hat. I do wonder whether T-levels being so chunky as the equivalent of 3 A-levels, it doesn't give any opportunity to study alongside, so you can't mix and match like you can with A-levels and B-Techs, where you can have that kind of nice element of perhaps doing a maths A-level with a B-Tech in engineering. You can't do that with T-levels. We did a qualitative piece of research before Christmas, interviewing 200 young people, and there was quite a mixed feeling about T-levels. Most were reasonably encouraging about T-levels, and they really appreciated it was a new qualification. So they were really cutting it some slack. We know it's new. We know that the teaching materials might not be as good as some of the other subjects that are well established, because we know the teachers are getting to grips with this. But it feels like it's very much in that guinea pig phase, and I get worried about young people being the guinea pigs. We can't really afford to let any young person go through any qualification without being absolutely clear what the aims and objectives are and what they will get at the end of it. So I think we have to have a really grown-up conversation about the bits of T-levels that are really good and the bits that are seriously requiring some challenging intervention, so that actually what we do have is a qualification that people are proud to have taken, that employers will acknowledge. We also know that a number of universities aren't taking T-levels, so a lot of T-level students think they'll probably go on to university, but a third of Russell Group aren't accepting them. So I think we've got to be really clear with young people what their options are and whether that is the right option for them. So gold standard, not yet, but I think with serious grown-up approach, they could be another additional element to the landscape.
So also I'd agree. I don't think they are necessarily the gold standard. I do think they are a good qualification, though. We've talked about the increased size of the qualification, the industry placement, the simplification of choices for young people, I think all being positive steps. We talked before about how young people who complete T-levels are more likely to progress to high technical qualifications, part of the missing middle that we've been looking to build for many years now. So I think they have an important part in the ecosystem to play. Scalability, I think, is my concern. They're not, the size and challenge of them means that they're not for all students, plus, of course, the slight narrowness of T-levels. Our research showed that retention was an issue for some students, with 20% of students on T-levels being 20% less likely to complete than students doing similar-sized alternative qualifications. Particularly disadvantaged students are more likely to drop out of T-levels. So I think there's clearly still challenges. They're not for all. What I would add is that whilst T-levels, I think, are a good qualification within a wider ecosystem, I think the transition programme is definitely not gold standard, with only around 8% of those on the transition programme transitioning to T-levels, and of those that do, around a quarter drop out in the first year. So there's clearly a lot of work to be done still on the transition programme.
Thank you. A number of you have raised issues thinking about the student experience, and we know that, generally they're less satisfied, more likely to drop out than peers doing other qualifications, and some of the things that have been cited as factors of that was lack of familiarity with the qualification and a misunderstanding of its purpose. I won't necessarily ask you all to comment on this just because of time, but if any of you do have one suggestion that would improve the appeal and the recognition of T-levels, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I think for me, I like the industrial experience, but if that could be done in other ways, so volunteering, social action, that sort of type of work, so they can get some of those generic so-called softer skills, that would be great, and also a bit more of a mix of assessment as well.
I would say that we need to get the market to want it more, and it is for an outcome. So universities not accepting a government-sponsored high quality qualification, what is going on there? Either the qualification is wrong, and why should it be acceptable in some institutions as others? So I think really working on the sort of the benefits that T-level students bring and the demand signal. And I would say the success of T-levels, I think, has been rooted in two things. The first thing is, whenever you meet a T-level student, they are really enjoying their course of education. I get that people drop out, but actually they're brilliant advocates for it, as are the people who teach them. And secondly, I think there has been an element of political consensus that they're a good thing to be doing, and I think that has helped sustain the programme through what has been quite a difficult birth. So I think maintaining that, but also thinking about actually how we make sure that people who've done these qualifications are welcome in all scenarios, is something that we need to really think about.
And maybe the other point is they've been pretty costly, 1.75 billion so far. And for this to be successful, it can't just be about throwing more money at it. We've got to think about those structural elements that aren't quite working at the moment. And if we get those right, then they will find their place in the landscape as part of it. But I think there needs to be some quite major structural changes.
And I know a number of you made suggestions in your answers to the first question, so that's good to have those on record as well. Thank you.
Go to Mark. Can I encourage you at this point in the agenda to be as succinct as you can be in your answers, just because we want to hear from you on a number of different topics still, and we're going to be struggling with the time to get to the next panel as well. But Mark, thank you.
Focusing right down then on industry placements and also working with the industry too. You all know how important it is that the industry placements feature in T-levels, and yet this committee has heard evidence previously, and Ofsted has also said the industry is not working as closely as it could be in the design and implementation of T-levels. So starting with Robert, who talked about this briefly earlier, do you agree, and how would you improve it?
I think employers are deeply involved in the commissioning of T-levels, and unlike other qualifications, actually we are required to engage with employers throughout the process, as opposed to prevent a qualification at the end of a development process and ask employers to approve it. And actually, if you look at the way that IFATE has engaged with awarding organisations, it's been hugely about the employer engagement. So I would take issue with the evidence that you've been presented.
Oh, yes. So you think that they are engaged enough and designing the T-levels?
Oh, absolutely. And if you look at, over 100 employers are being consulted. You have to present a list of the employers that you're consulting to IFATE, who scrutinise it. It's been the major issue that was being taken up with awarding organisations. I think there's more employer engagement on T-levels than any other qualification. I'm astonished that somebody can think otherwise.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Darren?
Yeah, I think for me, if I just take it away from T-level bit and just wider skills policy, I'm 30 years in this year, and I think what I've seen in that time, and it probably gets to the kernel of the problem for me, that policymakers tend to focus on the supply of skills. And they tend to then tinker with things, so such as qualifications. We've heard of that today, different types of qualifications, and again there's been an alphabet soup of qualifications in the vocational skill out over 30 years. We tend to tinker with targets, so remember 50% of people going to higher education, 3 million apprentices not too long ago. I think there's a current one, it might have been with the previous government, of so many prisoners getting apprenticeships, and again we keep having these targets and keep missing them. But so we tinker with qualifications, we tinker with targets, we tinker with structures. We've got UTCs, we've had national colleges, we've had different iterations, we've had the area review, and I understand why policymakers tinker with those things, because they're easy to tinker with. But the kernel of the problem I think we've got in the country is not so much supply. You'll probably hear from David Hughes sitting behind me in the Association of Colleges. Nearly 90% of FE colleges are good or better when it comes to Ofsted. And as a principal of the college, I can always do better. Sorry, I'm waffling. But the issue is with demand for skills, the utilisation of skills, and the investment in skills. They're the key problems. Just to echo those, just to underline those, demand for skills. 1 in 5 firms takes on an apprentice in this country. We should be sitting around here saying, how do we galvanise the 1 in 5 who don't? But 4 in 5 don't, and 1 in 5 do. Utilisation, there's lots of evidence, certainly in the North East, where we export talent out of the area. We can't necessarily utilise the skills and qualifications that we've got. And investment, as I've said before, David's organisation, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, highlight the lack of investment in skills, but then also that's echoed by employers as well. But the Learning and Work Institute do a wonderful report about employer investment in skills, and that's at record lows as well. So I think for me, it's the kernel of the problem: how do we stimulate demand, utilisation and investment in skills, and tinker less with the supply of skills? But by and large, for me, that's in the right place.
Thank you very much. Alice?
I think when we talk about employers, we get quite hung up with the big boys. So it's BAE Systems and it's Rolls-Royce, but actually, Britain is driven by SMEs, and SMEs are the powerhouse of this country, and they will be where most young people work. And we forget that they don't have the same capacity as these big organisations to help and support young people, either, whether that's through the youth guarantee or through apprenticeships or on T-levels. So I think we need to think about how we structurally support employers to do the best they can, because we are asking of them a lot. They're not always clear what that ask is. And if they're an SME, they don't necessarily have the wraparound support of numerous staff and an HR department to be able to kind of really galvanise their organisation, to be able to support young people, but also be able to take advantage of the talent. Because, of course, they want these young people to come through and to grow with their businesses, because that's the way that they will achieve success. So I think things like ATAs, we've seen some brilliant examples in some of the regions, like I'm thinking of Liverpool City region, where you've got real support for SMEs to be able to bring together young people with who are looking to go down that route of either direct employment or apprenticeships or work placements or industry placements, and the employers to give them an opportunity to understand what the ask is. So the more we do on that, I think the better.
Thank you. And then finally, David, on the planning and implementation of T-levels, are employers involved enough?
So I think I'll echo some of what Anna said. I'll try to keep it brief, which is that I think it's an issue of small employers. in particular SMEs and their engagement. So we undertook some research in partnership with Oxford University recently, where we did case studies of different industries across UK nations. And one of the things that came out time and time again there was, for small employers, the difficulty engaging with education and training structures, large amounts of bureaucracy for relatively small organisations, and the feeling that they're excluded from policy making. So I think, one of the key tasks for Skills England going forward will be to make sure that SMEs are as involved in the processes as are larger organisations.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Hello. I'm going to ask you now about maths and English resits. So most students who've not attained level 2 maths and English have to continue to study these subjects in order to continue any kind of further education. Do you think this policy benefits students, and what impact do you think the policy has had on students and teachers since it was introduced? And I'm going to start with Darren.
Glass half full, glass half empty. I'm just glad I've got a glass. So I'll start with glass half full. I think I read something the other week, 500,000, since this policy came in, 500,000 young people have now got GCSE, have achieved a good grade in GCSE English and GCSE Maths since the policy came in. Like me, I got my GCSE Maths when I was 22. I'm sure that's opened up vast opportunities for them. And I think I'm right in saying that is probably the only education disadvantage gap which is now closing, that those students who didn't achieve those qualifications at 16 who go on to achieve them by the age of 18 or 19. And again, I think that's something that the FE sector has done and embraced and done remarkably well. That said, the achievement rate isn't good enough. My college's achievement rate isn't good enough. Lots of students do embrace the opportunity to resit it. Lots feel disheartened. Lots feel failed by the system, and probably things that we've talked about before. And ultimately, as a college, we're trying to do in 100 hours what they've not managed to achieve in 12 years of primary and secondary education. Again, I'll go back to the means with the investment. I've got 580 hours. Ironically, the government want me to deliver, DFE want me to deliver a programme of study for 612 hours, but they only fund me for 580 hours. For an 18-year-old, it's 490 hours. So I've got to take 200 hours of that to do English and maths. But then I've got employers, so I might have a young person who wants to be an automotive engineer, a bricklayer, a carpenter, designer, electrician, a fabricator. I've got to train them with the remaining 350 hours as well as GCSE English and Maths. It's just, you're not giving me the means to do the job, to do everything I need to do. So glass half full, it's helped 500,000 young people. They've gone on and other opportunities, but there are still lots and lots of young people who are disenfranchised by what's happened before they get to a college in Sydney. I think it probably is ripe to an opportunity to do things differently. There's been talk of a stepping stone qualification, but it has helped, say, 500,000 people, and say 30 years ago it helped benefit me and open many, many doors for me as well.
Maybe Alice or David, do either of you have any research on how you think it's affected students and teachers, the resit policy?
So I actually don't think we know how well the resit policy is benefiting young people. We know very well that young people who pass at 16 are more likely to progress to high levels of education, they're more likely to have good employment outcomes. Fundamentally, I don't think we know whether the same is true of students who resit, and for me that's a really, really important evidence gap that we should be looking to fill. What we do know is that once you take into account student characteristics, actually there's not that much variation in the performance between different colleges or different institutions, particularly in maths. So in English, there is still some difference in college performance once you've controlled for other factors. So for me, I'm not sure we need the same policy for numeracy that we do for literacy. It may be that there's more good practice that can be shared for literacy to improve standards across the board. For numeracy, I think probably the policy needs a bit more of a wholesale rethink. We've talked a bit more, Alice has mentioned previously, about a more of a baccalaureate approach. We know that many countries can continue study of maths to 18 for all students. We could be focusing on the benefits of that for students across the board, which would also have the important side benefit of reducing stigma for those who are doing resits. So I think certainly for maths, we may need a different approach. English, I think there's more progress to be made under the current set of policies.
Okay. Very quickly.
Very briefly, I think we should think about digital as well. CAR seems to be on the right thing, but looking at pre-16, other things I would suggest, more flexibility. A progression is better than a buy. We've given a buy in apprenticeships. I think they're level 1 qualifications, get people moving. Much more leverage that we could do of English and maths in occupational, in apprenticeships and occupational qualifications. And the resit policy is an utter nightmare. For City of Portsmouth College, it has to close 3 out of its 4 campuses. It's got 1,200 students that are due to do their resits. Takes a whole day out of the programme, and 200 of those have got SEN requirements as well. It destroys the delivery of education more broadly across the college for a significant period of time.
Thank you. So we're really pushed for time, but just briefly on this, obviously literacy and numeracy skills are so important for job prospects and success in later life. If there was an effective alternative to the resit policy, if any of you have a quick idea about what that might look like, then we'd love to hear.
I think an expert group thinking about the content of maths and English at GCSE would be a really good place to start, because after all, FE colleges are dealing with the failure that's happened up to that point. So I think that would be a really, really good starting point.
Looking at it at a post-16 level, or going back and looking at what's happening before that?
Going back and, once again, going back and looking at the issue, because it is an issue if young people have been at school for that period of time and have got to 16 and haven't got a level 4 and then do resits and still can't get a level 4. And your point about the impact on teachers and young people is, anecdotally, it's quite punishing. The English and maths tutors get paid less in FE than they do in the mainstream, and they're trying to bring on young people that have really struggled all of that time to then crack that nut in 2 years. And for the young person, they've already feel that they have failed at GCSE, to then repeatedly fail.
Soul destroying.
It's soul destroying.
I think it's got to be driven by a real sense of purpose as well, rather than just academic qualification.
What do we want?
Yeah,
do we want them to be able to? Do we want young people to be able to effectively communicate and be effectively able to understand maths in an applied manner, so that they're able to start a business like an electrician or whatever? Or do we want them to get, that GCSE at level 4 or level 5? What's the purpose? If we understand the purpose, I think we can cure the problem.
Completely agree.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jess.
We know that economically disadvantaged students do not perform as well as their peers. What interventions are needed in FE to support disadvantaged students and narrow the attainment gap? And EPI obviously have called for a student premium. How might this help? I'll come to you, David, first.
Yeah, so we know that much of the reason that disadvantaged students finish the 16 to 19 phase with lower grades is due to the fact that they start it with lower grades. So, of course, we need to think about supporting those students all the way through their education from early years, all the way through to 16 to 19 and beyond. But we also know that in this phase, disadvantaged students fall behind by the equivalent of around an A-level grade, not just A-levels, but we equivalize it in terms of A-level grades. So they are falling further behind in this phase. We also know that at the age of 16, disadvantage funding falls by about a third. So those same students who one day at the end of secondary school were getting a certain amount of support just falls off when they then start their post-16 education. We've proposed a student premium. We think it should be piloted so that we can understand the impact of that policy. Should come with similar arrangements to pupil premium in terms of provider accountability. But unless we can grasp why we have this drop-off and the impacts that that's having, I think we're going to struggle to make progress with closing that gap.
I think we need to look very carefully at assessment as well. And I think Robert made a really good point about SEND. SEND isn't about lack of ability. It's about being able to be supported to be able to achieve your potential. So I think we need to. We talk about exams being the easiest way to test something. Easy isn't good. Easy is a cheap way out. What we need to think about is a way in which we can assess fairly young people's ability, so that when they go into the world of work, they can be the very best, they can be an excellent employee, they can be dynamic, and they can be good at their job. So, that can be projects, that can be mastery, that can be oracy, that can be beautiful work, and some of that can be exams as well, because there are some bits where exams make sense. And I think if we get that right, it will also support those young people from deprived areas who might find the cramming for a cliff edge exam once a year much more difficult, particularly if they are also neurodiverse. So there's lots of ways that we can support young people, but we need to have a follow through. So in school, young people feel generally quite supported, and when they go into an FE college, it's not that they're not, it's suddenly a huge and big kind of place that they're not sure about, and it's change, and that all has an impact on what happens next. And we see the same in HE with that dropout in that first term or first year. So I think there's a lot we can do to support young people with mentoring, but thinking about how assessment can actually, it isn't a privilege for those people who can cram for an exam and get a good mark. It's actually about fairness, and it's about dynamism, and it's about grabbing a nettle, and it's about quite a tough conversation about how to get that right, because it's really important that we can have trust in the system. So it's not about it being easy and everybody winning, it is about rigour, but it's about thinking about really in a very grown-up way how we can change our assessment system to incorporate all of those things, which will then in turn assist the whole broad spectrum of young people.
Very briefly, Dan.
Yeah, it's again from the chalk face. Again, I think the sector is wonderful. It's diverse. We do a lot of good work with people from disadvantaged background. The vast majority want to learn, develop, improve, get better, prepare for the next steps, whether it's work or higher education, and vast majority do. I think the increase in poverty has been a big issue over the last few years, and I think there was some research out from Durham University just about and again, particularly in the northeast, the depth of poverty. So how long a student's been in poverty for, and then how widespread that is. And again, that the northeast didn't come out well in that research. We're finding more and more of our students have to study and work, some of those to support their families. We've had students who have dropped out of their college course to go and work, and that work has been precarious work. It's been 0-hour contracts, and they would have been better off in the longer term staying in college but dropping out. And we've also had a rise of sort of adverse impacts as well, so a rise of students experience sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, domestic violence, suicide attempts, gambling, substance misuse. So again, with the investment that we get, we're trying to do our very, very best to keep the stabilisers on the sector, the colleges. Pick up on David's point, the support we get does drop off a bit. Also, we have to apply for that. So if I was a secondary school head teacher, that information would come to me about my new Year 7 students, and that information about their support and the finance would follow. As a further education college, I have to seek that out from the students and apply and apply for it. So now we've got a small army of people who work on just sorting that out, the bursary, and making sure that the support is in place. So anything that can be done to make that a little bit more seamless, anything that can be done to make that a little bit more substantial. As I said before, free school meals, child benefit, universal credit for their families, that's not kept up with inflation as well. So the college is doing a wonderful job despite the circumstances that we're facing.
And very quickly, Robert.
Primarily it's a policy issue, not a qualifications issue. And I think we need to think about how we can leverage regional ownership of this, because it's such a localised problem. I see that in Portsmouth. And also I think we need to think much more about focusing on students and an individual and thinking about their potential and how we use that to inform their choices in education and encourage them to do it. And I definitely don't think we apply the science that is available to us to really support students make the best choices for them.
Thank you. Can I ask for your very, very brief thoughts on what actually is a really big topic? So apologies for that, but we are getting very close to being completely out of time. Student attainment between the ages of 16 and 19 varies quite wildly across the country. Why do some parts of the country achieve better than others, and what can be done to remove that postcode lottery on attainment?
Yeah, I say for me, poverty is a key thing, as I've alluded to before. That is just such a big barrier for lots of our students in terms of some of the adverse impacts it's having on them, as I've just mentioned, and I won't repeat them, and the fact that they have to juggle, the vast majority of them are juggling work, part-time work, full-time work, precarious work with.
There is, so I suppose I'm more interested in then how different areas of the country that might have comparable levels of poverty achieve different outcomes. So some places, so poverty undoubtedly has an impact on the delivery, but some places do better than others at helping their students to overcome that. Any clues as to why?
I think it comes down to aspiration, and I travel all around the country, and it's interesting to walk around at lunchtime to see how young people they move around and do their business. And I think there needs to be much more focus on aspiration, and I think some of the changes that we see in the way regional government and local government's been organised potentially provides that opportunity, but it's really got to leverage that.
I think we've seen some really neat examples around the country of both FE colleges and schools doing some really innovative stuff, but also thinking about something like the Greater Manchester area. They've conceived this idea around an MBAC. It's about how you bring young people into the 7 most evolving and innovative industries in the area, and then how you kind of create a pathway to those. So, when you have initiatives like that, you can see how young people can firstly feel inspired, but also understand the route in, and then are supported to do that. It all starts earlier though. It all starts in school. It's all about making sure that young people are aware about the choice. It's also about giving schools flexibility within the system to be able to deliver interesting curriculum. It's about making it real and relevant, and if those young people are engaged, then they are far more likely to get better results and far more likely to enter the workplace with the skills that they need to succeed.
Just briefly, we know that most of the gap between regions is driven by differences at GCSE that then follow through to post-16 education. I think the North West is a really interesting exception to that, and that's where I'd want to start looking. I don't know what they're doing, but it does look like there's some success there. They have the second lowest attainment of any region at the age of 16, but by the age of 18 they have the third highest. So I'd want to understand what's going on in the North West.
Yeah, I don't think the North East is too far behind. But sorry, Helen, just to push back on that research out of Durham University, Garrard and Siddiqui and a few others, they said that the deeper and the wider it is, and the North East does have a lot more than that than other areas. That does have an impact. So
No, without a doubt.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And I thank all 4 of our the witnesses on our first panel. Order if we just suspend the broadcast to change over panel. To our second set of witnesses for attending the Education Select Committee this morning. Can I invite all of you to introduce yourselves to the committee first, please, starting with Jo.
Hello, my name is Jo Grady and I am the General Secretary of UCU, which is the University and College Union, and we represent 120,000 staff in post-16 education.
Imran.
Good morning, my name is Imran Tahir. I'm a research economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. The IFS is an independent research institute who uses economics to analyse public policy.
Hi, David Hughes. I'm from Association of Colleges, representing nearly all the general FE colleges, quite a few of the sixth form colleges and a lot of specialist colleges.
And Bill Watkin, Chief Executive of the Sixth Form Colleges Association, representing 150 odd colleges.
Thank you very much. The further education sector has experienced a prolonged period of reduced funding. So we know that between 2010 and 2019, funding per student fell in real terms by 14% in colleges and by 28% in school sixth forms. Can you describe the impact this has had on the sector? I might start with Bill.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. It's it's been the case that people have had to cut courses, they've had to reduce the leadership team size, they've had to lose some of the student support, and particularly at a time with mental health and enrichment activities feeling the pinch. So we did a piece of research not so very long ago, which we called the Funding Impact Survey, which found that half of colleges had dropped a modern foreign language, with French, Spanish and German being the main victims. A third had dropped STEM courses, and 78% of colleges had reduced or removed student support services and enrichment extracurricular activities, and that includes, of course, all the employability skills and careers and so on. And 4 in 5 colleges had increased class sizes in order to make them more viable, and 50% of them had reduced teaching time. So lots of different strategies for making cost savings, because it's been a very difficult period.
Yeah, I think look, there are 4 really big impacts. I think one is that one on students. They're getting 15, 16 hours a week. In most OECD countries, it's 25 to 30 hours a week. That means the ones who need the most support aren't getting it. From the most disadvantaged households. And that impact is hard to see because they're still achieving, but they're not achieving quite as much as they would have done. There's a big loss of learning opportunities for adults. So 5.4 million opportunities 20 years ago, down to something like 2.3 million opportunities. That's millions of adults missing out on opportunities to retrain every year and to get the jobs, to progress, to get better work. Pay has suffered massively. So if you teach or work in FE, you get paid a lot less than you did in relative terms 20 years ago, because the investment has been squeezed. And the fourth, I think, is on employers, who find it really difficult to know where to invest. So employers invest less than half of their EU counterparts. I think it's because they don't know where to go, and it's confusing. There's not the capacity to deliver, because pay for staff means we can't get construction lecturers, so employers can't go and get construction training in colleges as easily as they used to. So 4 big impacts. I mean, we could go on, but they're the big ones.
Thank you. Imran.
So you also see this on the financial statements of colleges. We've seen a number of colleges struggle increasingly during the 2010s. So at the start of 2010, 16% of colleges were in deficit. By the halfway point of that decade, over 50% of colleges were in deficit. And that led to a huge program of merging and financial consolidation within the sector, which has radically reduced the number of colleges that we have in the country. So beginning in 2010, we had almost 350 colleges. Nowadays, it's closer to 200, about 220. And that really does limit the amount of colleges available to individuals geographically.
Okay.
Thank you. I think, as has already been alluded to, further education, I think, has really been run into the ground by what have been continuous funding cuts now since 2010. And, let's be honest, I think Labour is inheriting a real legacy of the last Conservative government, and I have to say I think it's telling that none of their representatives are here right now to listen to this inquiry. In terms of the impact that this has had on staff and on students, staff in FE have really borne the brunt of this neglect. As has already been pointed out by David, they are underpaid, they are overworked, they are frequently disregarded. In terms of low pay, I do not think it is over the top to say that it is killing FE. The quality of what can be delivered in the classroom is dependent on how staff are treated. The working conditions of staff are the learning conditions of students. And just a few statistics to get us going. FE teachers, lecturers are paid 25% less than school teachers. They're paid half of what they could earn if they go into industry. We have huge shortages of staff, particularly in some areas in FE. We have appalling retention rates, which I'm going to get onto later. The sector is recruiting minimal amounts of people who are young. I think 1.7% of staff, maybe even less than that, are under 25. And, we're losing many to industry. So we've seen some funding this year, 300 million, But to be frank, whilst it's better than nothing, it isn't even keeping us standing still. And I think some of Imran's points around how many colleges we've lost and the staff that we've lost is telling.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Caroline.
I'm going to have to stay.
Okay, Jess, do you want to pick that up then?
Yeah. The government announced 300 million in the autumn budget. How will this money be allocated, and what will the FE sector use it for? Could I go to Bill?
Can we just be first of all clear which 300 million, because there were two 300 million pots. One was for capital and one was for revenue. So I'm guessing that you're referring to the revenue.
Revenue.
Yes. I'm asking about capital.
Thank you. Okay. So this is being put onto the funding rate, and which we're very pleased about, because we've always contested that it's important that principals are in a position to make a decision according to local context and local need. So much better to invest in the funding rate, the per capita funding attached to each student, it was part of our judicial review discussions that we would this money would be ring fenced for 16 to 19 rather than the broader FE sector. And actually, if I could just go off track slightly at this point and say that I didn't recognise necessarily everything that Joe was saying earlier for the majority of colleges that the Sixth Form Colleges Association represent. And it seems to me this is one of the challenges facing an inquiry like this, is the FE sector is so broad that there's such a wide range of provider types all lumped into FE that it's sometimes difficult to hear evidence and discern which applies to which group. So, for example, things like teacher pay as opposed to lecturer pay in colleges, it's not necessarily the same situation. And so sixth form colleges don't have, for example, the retention problems, and some of them even have actually the reverse of that. They have staff rooms peopled by people who've been there for a very long time, and the pay gap is less in sixth form colleges, largely because sixth form colleges are fish in the same pool as schools to recruit their teachers, and therefore must remain competitive. So I'm going slightly off track, I recognise this, but in answer to your question about the 300 million, this will make a significant difference to the funding next year, and we were very pleased that next year doesn't look to be quite as difficult as it might have been without it.
David.
Yeah, so for general FE colleges, just to make the distinction, I mean, I think this is quite helpful, but the 16 to 18 funding only makes up about 60% of their income. And on the other side, the adult budget is being cut yet again. So what that means is that it's very, very difficult to balance it. And come back to Joe's point about pay, you know, it's incredibly difficult to address the pay issue when 40% of your budget isn't changing at all. The adult budget hasn't changed in the funding rate per student since 2010. That's quite a staggering statement. You know, just think about that. The amount of cash paid for a student in 2010 is now the same cash 15 years later. It's appalling. And the amount of money is more than halved as well, so there are fewer opportunities. I think the other issue we've got is we know that there's a growing cohort of young people coming into FE. Colleges got about 37,000 extra students this year. We think there'll be another 25,000 next year. They're not going to be funded because the government hasn't got the in-year funding available to support them. So you've got a real challenge for colleges, some of whom are getting hundreds of students coming in to be recruited, and the college is not funded for all of that growth. You don't get that in any other part of the education system. And the government this year paid 2/3 of their formula for that bit, only 2/3, having promised that they would pay it. For next year, I don't think they've got the funding, and we think that's a massive risk to the system. So it's good news in some ways, but it's still too little, and it doesn't address the wider issues of adult education and training, which is crying out for investment.
Imran.
So that £300 million, what we know is £50 million is going to be used as a one-off grant for FE colleges and other FE providers to provide their staff with pay awards. We estimate that's going to translate to a 2 to potentially 3% increase in pay relative to what it is today. The other £250 million is going to be used to increase the 16 to 19 funding rate by 3.86%. What that actually means in per pupil terms, so we've done some forecasting to figure out what this means for per pupil funding. Actually, per pupil funding isn't going to change relative to what it is today. And that's because inflation and the demographic growth, which is currently working its way through the 16 to 18 education system, essentially means that all of that additional funding is eaten up by this maintaining the level of per pupil funding across this broader base of students. So essentially, we're running to stand still at the moment.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to add a bit more sort of staff-based context to some of the answers. It's true, as has already been said, that funding for adult education has been decimated. In-classroom funding for adult education is 40% lower than it was in 2010. As I've said, the pay for staff in colleges has been cut significantly in terms of what it would have been worth in 2010. There's a 25% pay gap between school teachers and college lecturers. So in terms of people leaving the sector, we're seeing both funding cuts to students wanting to study and wage cuts to people wanting to stay and teach. So I think this is having a huge impact on who can access education. It's having a huge impact on who chooses to stay in education. If I could read you one quotation, and it's from a survey that we did with our members called On the Breadline. This is just one quote, but this document is full of similar. My day consists of a banana for breakfast and then later a pot noodle or a mini tortilla wrap with a slice of wafer-thin ham. I drink mostly water and have a jar of Tesco Value instant coffee, which I ration. This report is full of people saying they work the part-time, other low-paid jobs at weekends, full of people saying they've moved geographical locations because they can't stay there, people saying that they ration the amount of hot meals they eat in a week because they can't afford heating, people who've called in sick because they can't afford to get to work. £50 million out of this 300, which, you know, thank you for putting a number on it, 2 to 3% on your pay. FE workers didn't get a pay increase last year. Any pay increases that we've had over subsequent years, in most cases, have been fought for by members because the bargaining that we get through the AOC isn't binding. So a 2 to 3% pay rise, you know, that's barely going to cover any car parking charges if people are even driving to work. It's not going to close that 25% pay gap. So it isn't that people aren't acknowledging that this is progress or that it's welcome, but it isn't even helping us stand still. And it certainly isn't, in terms of staff pay, going to rectify the wrongs. And in terms of funding for all of those students that are missing out, it isn't going to do that either.
Okay, thank you. Tahir, the IFS has estimated that the government would need to allocate an additional 200 million annually in today's prices in order to sustain 16 to 18 education funding in real terms by 2027 to 28. What are the likely consequences to the sector if this funding is not met?
Yeah, and so just a bit of background on that statistic you've quoted. So what we've done is looked at the fact that there's obviously inflationary pressures, as there always are, and also demographic changes at the moment. So there's a demographic bulge working its way through the FE sector. It started in 2018. From 2018 up until 2024, we saw the number of young people increase by 230,000 in England. Up until 2028, there's going to be an additional 110,000 16 to 18-year-olds in England. That translates to about 60,000 additional students that need to be accommodated by the sector. So looking forward to 27-28, in order to accommodate those extra students and pay exactly the same level of funding in real terms, you're going to need £200 million of additional funding. Now, if you don't get that funding, as my fellow panellists have mentioned, the financial situation for colleges at the moment is very difficult. So finding additional savings on top of that is going to be incredibly difficult. And now, that was just one of the scenarios that we considered in our report. So if the government did decide to freeze per pupil funding in real terms, you'd require an additional £200 million. Another couple of scenarios we considered is what would happen if the government actually froze the amount that they spend on 16 to 19 education in real terms. So this, at the moment, we spend about £8.3 billion on 16 to 19 education. If the government were to uprate that by inflation up until 27-28, that would result in a 4% fall in per pupil funding. If the government froze it in cash terms, so this £8.3 billion was exactly the same figure in 27-28, that would result in an 8% fall in per pupil funding. So incredibly difficult for the sector.
Okay, thank you. And can I ask David, do you agree with the IFS's assessment of £200 million needed, or is it more in your estimate?
It is. I think it's a really good estimate. I think it's difficult to assess because we don't know about learner choices. We've seen more young people not staying on in school sixth forms, partly because the English and maths requirements means the schools don't want them. Trying to find 100 hours of teaching in a school for an English or maths resit or both is really difficult. So I think actually it could be that we underestimated, IFS is underestimating because they'll be tending to do more technical courses which cost more and therefore the average cost per student might be higher. And I think with the labour market getting tighter as well, we might see more young people who are in work coming back into FE colleges, and that could boost that pressure on the budget. So the spending review has to recognise those numbers because otherwise the sector is on its knees. It will be a cataclysmic, I think.
I would add the industrial relations landscape is looking unsettled at least for the next couple of years.
Fine. Carry on. We don't need to react to that one. It will go again in 3 minutes' time, and we can ignore that as well. Yeah.
So I think the cost pressures will increase, and so it's not just is funding going to keep pace with inflation and with wage rises and so on, but I think a host of different costs are going to put pressure on colleges and make it even more difficult to get by. I think as well the increased demand on colleges and particularly on staff working in colleges is another factor. So the capacity of NHS, local authorities, external agencies to provide the kind of support that was available in years gone by isn't there. So there's a greater demand on colleges to provide those frontline services that previously would have been provided elsewhere, and that puts additional cost pressures on institutions.
Thank you. And finally, Jo.
Thank you. I think there's the twofold struggle that the Labour government's inherited of, increased demand, which has been covered, is to some extent demographic, and how we ensure that we fund that. But I think there's also the quite right increased ambition from Labour, that we need a decade of national renewal, that we need to grow our economies and we need to heal our communities. And we are only going to deliver on that if we find the money to properly fund further education. And I think that's of crucial importance to all of us. So whether or not the figure that Imran has helpfully provided is accurate, it has to be the starting point, or we are not going to change the economic outcome of this country, and we're not going to deliver for our communities either. And I think, part of that is ensuring that we deliver for young people, but there has been a completely forgotten group of people under the last government, which is adult learners, and the adult learning budget has been slashed. And if we're wanting to see those people transition back into the labour market in a supportive way, then we have to make sure that we are giving colleges the money and the resources to do that as well, and we don't see that at the minute.
Darren.
Thank you. And I should probably put on record, Chair, that until my election I was a member of the UCU, which Jo leads. Let's turn to the other 300 million that we were mentioning, so the capital funding for colleges, which was announced for 25-26. How do each of you believe that funding should be prioritised? If I could maybe start with Bill and come this way.
Well, it would be nice if sixth form colleges could have access to that funding, because at the moment they're not eligible for it. So they have not had the opportunity to bid for any capital funds since 2022. And that, of course, is going to mean problems for their estate, both in terms of maintenance, but also in terms of providing additional accommodation for the population bulge that's going to carry on working its way through the sector until 28 or even the end of the decade. So at the moment, with no capital opportunities at all, we think it's extremely important that we pick up where we left off with the Post-16 Capacity Fund, which ran for 3 years of the previous spending review window, and which made a big difference. 90 colleges being awarded 230 million over 3 years, and that provided additional capacity. And one of the things about the capital and capacity is that if we're going to accommodate, as we have to accommodate, all the extra 16 to 19-year-olds in the population, we're faced with a choice of whether to increase the capacity of existing provision or to build new provision. And it's, of course, much more cost-effective to increase the capacity of existing provision. Coupled with that, you've got the reassurance that they are established and have a track record of success, which means you can be more confident about what you're developing. So there's a real need.
Yeah, look, colleges operate about 4,500 buildings on 800 sites, so 300 million isn't an enormous amount of money. What the DfE are doing is putting a formula together to try and kind of divvy it up between the 160 odd general FE colleges. I think that's good. They'll get a grant, they'll be able to spend it over maybe 2 to 3 years on mainly on condition, maintenance, just improvement, stopping the roof leak, stopping the windows falling in. What we need is that kind of number every year. We're talking 1.5 to 2 million for an average college, which again, at one level you think it's a lot of money, but these are big estates with a lot of equipment. If you want cutting edge technology that matches industry, if we want an industrial strategy that's really going to push us ahead in terms of productivity, colleges need to have the kit, the equipment, the premises to match that. This doesn't do that. So in Sheffield they need a big construction centre. That probably needs 30 million alone. They can't get that. They can't borrow now. So colleges, when they became public sector, were prevented from borrowing commercially. So lots of opportunities are being missed. There's a very strong argument to give colleges the ability to borrow, maybe through the public sector or commercially, to allow them to have that entrepreneurial approach to getting the equipment that's needed for the economy, for the growth strategy, for the missions.
Thank you. Now, I think meeting those two challenges we've already alluded to. So this demographic bulge working its way through the FE sector, ensuring that we have enough classroom spaces, enough building space available to young people to study. The second point is, of course, over the 2010s, we saw a number of colleges shut down for financial reasons, which solidified the financial situation of the sector to an extent, but it's meant that there are far fewer colleges available in different parts of the country today than there were a decade or so ago.
So a key motivation behind the reclassification of FE as a public sector was, and I think Imran just alluded to it, the huge deficits that we had across the sector. Many providers were in the red, unable to maintain and repair college estates. So we considered, the reintroduction of FE and the capital transformation programme by the DfE in 2023 welcome. And I think other panellists have already spoken about how crucial it is to make sure that our colleges are equipped, that the buildings are fit for purpose, and especially for some disciplines that we have the best technology to facilitate learning. I guess the one sort of note of caution that you would expect me as the voice of staff in this to say is that in terms of spending priorities, we have seen in higher education how capital investment can sometimes be wasteful or damaging or lead to kind of vanity projects. we wouldn't want to see that being carried over into FE. And I would just make one other comment as well. We have seen the announcement around technical excellence colleges, but I think just to go back to the point that I made earlier, when we have such endemic levels of low pay in FE, when we have people leaving the sector in rates that they're not leaving any other education sector, the last thing we want to see is underpaid vacant roles not in buildings that are therefore empty, where we can't attract the staff to be in perhaps the facilities that we are investing in. So yes, investment in those facilities is incredibly important, but it can't outpace us addressing the underpayment, the chronic underpayment of staff.
Thank you. A number of you on the panel have mentioned the rising number of students in the sector, and we've heard that obviously extra capacity space and equipment is going to be needed to accommodate them. Does the government's capacity funding go far enough on that? And if not, what else can be done by providers and teachers to mitigate the rising number?
Open
field on this one.
It's definitely not enough, and I think they recognise that. I mean, they've had to intervene in 2 or 3 geographical areas in this year to provide capital just to deal with. Leeds is a good example where they've put extra capital in. They haven't got enough to do that in all the places they need to, and therefore you've got colleges facing literally 500, 600, 700 students that want to learn in that college, and unfortunately they just don't have the physical capacity. Joe's point, they also don't have the staffing capacity to meet those needs, and I think we are in serious risk of the NEET numbers, which are nudging towards 1 million, going up to over 1 million, simply because colleges don't have the capacity to meet the needs. There's a real problem here that DfE recognises, but Treasury doesn't seem to have woken up to.
If I could add to that, because the issues once that trickles into the classroom is obviously there's kind of literal capacity issues in terms of how many students can you squeeze into a classroom, but we see way more students per classroom in FE colleges than we would in schools. That might not have the impact in terms of teaching one student. It may be seen as the same as teaching several in a classroom, but there is the pastoral care, there is the marking, there is everything else that goes along with that. So in terms of the capacity and the knock-on this has for staff, it cannot be overstated how damaging it is.
Anyone want to make any other comments? You don't have to. Okay, thank you very much.
Serena.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to consider now the government's response to the staff pay gap, and it was interesting to hear from some panel members that since 2010, in real terms, school teacher pay and college teacher pay has declined, and at the same time that gap has widened as well and is continuing to widen. So I'd like your thoughts on the government saying that from 2025 to 2026, all 16 to 19 education providers will be funded on an equitable basis. What does this mean to you, and does it go far enough to address the pay disparity that we are seeing? And I'll start with Jo.
My shorter answer is going to be no. I'm going to expand on that. I think there's an issue about colleges provide for people outside of 16 to 19, and we colleges therefore employ people doing a whole range of work, and I think we need to invest in adult learning as much as we're investing in younger person learning, and I think that's just a fact that the government can't get away from. I think it's a fact the previous government were not interested in addressing because their kids didn't go to colleges, and I don't think they cared about adult learners. Thankfully, we're not in that situation anymore, and we have a government that has a plan and a strategy to rebuild the economy, to invest in communities. So I think that means investing in colleges beyond the 16 to 19 and acknowledging the important work that they do. There can't be any possible excuse for Wales and Scotland to have closed the teacher college pay gap, but for us in England to still have a 25% gap. We need fair and equal pay deals across schools and colleges. At the moment, we don't have a fit-for-purpose collective bargaining framework for colleges in England. We have collective bargaining, we meet with David and the AOC, but any outcomes from that collective bargaining is not binding on college employers. So we see in some areas our members getting pay deals that they're able to recommend. We see in other areas pay and the value of that pay falling and falling and falling. So we need massive investment in further education, which includes adult learners, not just young people. We need fully funded and equitable pay offers across the board that don't just give us 2 or 3% in 1 year, but allow for that pay gap to be closed. And we need a new national collective agreements that are binding for every single college teacher in every single college. And I think, anything less than this will mean that our further education sector, our colleges, continue to hemorrhage really good staff. The people in this document that are leaving, they don't want to leave. They've chosen FE over schools, sometimes because they think they can make more of a difference there. So we will continue to hemorrhage staff if we don't address this, and Labour will find it impossible to achieve the ambitions that they want in terms of a decade of national renewal.
Okay, thank you, Jo. Imran?
So just to pick up on the statistics you were quoting about school teacher pay and college teacher pay falling in lockstep over the 2010s, you're right to say that. What we have seen recently, though, is that this gap between college teachers and school teachers has really opened up a lot over the past couple of years. So the gap now is around 18%. That's the largest gap in records, at least as far back as we know. What's often not picked up as well is what's happened with starting salaries as well. So actually, college teachers used to earn a higher starting salary than school teachers. Going back to 2010, there was actually a significant difference between the two. Over the 2010s, we've seen that reversed. So actually now, school teachers are starting to earn more as a starting salary than college teachers. And that's particularly important because we know that the salary early in your career really does matter. So in terms of the college teachers as well, they're not identical to school teachers as well. The outside options are quite different to school teachers. So industry is also a very frequent option for college teachers. And we see lots of college teachers either move to schools, other parts of the education system, or alternatively into industry. Now, the big difference between industry and college settings isn't just the absolute levels of pay, it's the fact that the college pay schedule is very compressed relative to what people can earn in industry. So you might start at a relatively good pay in a college, but 5-10 years later, you're not earning as much as you would do in industry. And that's one of the key reasons why retention is such an issue within colleges.
Okay, thank you, Imran. David?
Yeah, look, the funding statement they made about the same amount going into schools and colleges is sort of correct, but schools cross-subsidise. So in a school, you've got teachers who are teaching, pre-16 and post-16. They're being paid, at least 18%, in many cases more, because of that cross-subsidy. For colleges, the cross-subsidy comes from a budget that's been decimated, and therefore they can't do that. They can't match that. Sixth form colleges, in a sense, are better off because they've got big numbers, and the 16 to 18 rate has gone up a bit. So, and we mustn't forget the pupil premium that David Robinson talked about earlier. There is no pupil premium after the age of 16. There's no reason for that. There's no rationale for that. It was because DFE did it when the post-16 funding was in a different government department. That's why we absolutely should get that pupil premium into 16 to 19. That would make a massive difference for disadvantaged students. There's also a drop-off of funding at age 18. That was simply to save money. There is no reason why an 18-year-old who's trying to take 3 years to get to a good qualification outcome should get less funding than someone who's been successful in the system. They take 3 years because at 16 their qualifications were much lower. So that 3-year period is a real positive in the system. We then mustn't forget the NEAT numbers, the not in education, employment and training. We're nudging 1 million, and once you get to 19, you're in the adult funding system. And we've heard that that's been decimated, both in absolute terms, but also in the funding rate. So there's lots of problems in here that DfE, I think, is kind of just trying to ignore. They acknowledge that there's a risk that college pay, partly compared to schools and partly, as Imran said, compared to industry, is really poor. It means colleges can't get the construction and engineering and digital lecturers, and we've got lots of examples of that. Colleges turning away students, right? But they've done nothing to estimate how much will it cost. They've done nothing to put a plan in place. I'd really, really encourage you to put some pressure on DfE to come up with a plan to close that gap. Joe's right that we've got to close that pay gap. I think I agree with everything Joe says apart from the binding bit. I don't want a binding system on colleges when they can't afford it. If they're not going to be funded to close that pay gap, they can't be forced to do it. They just would not be able to make that work. But I think there is a real argument for a pay review body in this sector that gets backed by the government and gets supported to close the gap. I think there's a 3 to 5 year kind of time period for that to happen. It's complex, but if it was fully funded, then we'd all be happier about it.
Okay, thank you, David. And for Bill, I have a specific question regarding the Sixth Form College Association, because you withdrew your claim for a judicial review into the government's decision to exclude your members from the 5.5% pay award following talks with the government. What assurances did you receive that led to the withdrawal?
I'll just clarify that, if I may. The decision was made to fund a pay award for schools and academies, not for colleges. Mm-hmm. So some of our members were awarded the extra money and some weren't. And they're all part of the same National Joint Council negotiating mechanism. So we were in a very difficult position in that we were negotiating with teaching unions for a pay settlement when half of the members had received additional funding for a pay award and the other half hadn't. But it went further than that. There was a point of principle, we felt, which was that all the institutions, all colleges, not just sixth form colleges, but all colleges and schools are delivering a state-funded education for young people and should be treated in the same way. So the point of principle was parity, and we were very pleased to have the reassurance that there was a commitment to that parity for the future, and at least for the immediate future, and that the 50 million that's already been mentioned was brought forward to 24-25 so that colleges could get an extra injection of funding which would enable them to make a pay award that in the end brought about the end of industrial action in sixth form colleges. There was also a reassurance about that there would be no cliff edge in terms of what's affordable in 24-25 has got to be affordable in 25-26, otherwise it's a very Pyrrhic victory. And so we were reassured that funding levels in 25-26 would enable affordability. So picking up on the point about a funding mechanism, a negotiating mechanism for the whole FE sector, this goes back to my earlier point about how the FE sector is made up of very different provider types, and it's not necessarily the case that it would work to have one body to represent all elements of the FE sector. So we have a very different mechanism in the sixth form college world, and we take advice from college leaders, and we enter into a negotiation based on the parameters which we're given by them. And then we reach a settlement. In an ideal world, we reach a settlement, and all colleges in the sixth form college world apply that settlement. So there isn't the same kind of freedom, if you like, to negotiate locally, because they sign up to a national mechanism and it works, and there's a very strong support from teaching unions and from employers to continue to make that work. if there were to be one single mechanism for the whole sector, there would be huge cost implications if sixth form colleges were brought into that mechanism along with general FE colleges, because the pay differential is such that you could only harmonise terms and conditions and pay spines upwards unless you were going to face an absolute catastrophic industrial relations situation.
Okay, thank you, Bill. And then finally, just opening up to the panel, if there is any further steps that you think that this government should take in order for FE teachers to receive a fair pay deal. Any further suggestions?
As I said, I want them to do an estimate of how much it would cost. I mean, they've got the data. They get workforce survey data from every single college. They know what people are being paid. They need to put some analytical time into saying not just how much is the gap per member of staff on average, but what would it cost? And then they need a plan in place to say over what period will they close that gap. Until they do that, I think the words that they are committed to fair pay in FE are just vacant and wasted.
I think I would agree. I think estimating what it would cost and pledging to do that is a crucial first step. It's the only way in which we're going to stop hemorrhaging staff from FE. And I think, I would be interested as to what FE lecturers have lost since 2010 in unequal pay. We've done similar pay claims on the basis of gender and other characteristics. Our FE lecturers have been propping up post-16 education by being paid systematically less, and it has to end. But very quickly, I did say fully funded, David, so I think you might have been in full agreement with me before. So.
Shocking.
Can I just add to that I don't think we should look at teacher or lecturer pay totally separately from the service that they provide, the education that they provide for young people. So in sixth form colleges, for example, one of the reasons why the pay awards have reasonably kept pace with teachers is the cuts that have been made to provision. And so at the very beginning of this session, I talked about some of the impact of poor funding levels in recent years in terms of the support available to young people and the class size and the number of teachers and the constraints on the curriculum and courses that have got to be cut and so on. So we need to think about the package as a whole.
Thank you. Many of you have obviously mentioned the issues of pay in relation to retention, and we know that 25% of college teachers leave the profession after 1 year, compared with 15% of school teachers. Apart from the very, very important issue of pay, what are the other main reasons for this lower retention rate, and how can they be addressed, Bill?
We did a piece of work a number of years ago looking at, this is in a previous era of teacher shortage, and we did a piece of work looking at what it is that keeps people in the profession and what it is that attracts them to the profession in the first place. And clearly, pay, as you say, was an important factor, but it wasn't the most important factor. The most important factor of all was drawing attention to the moral purpose of the job, the variability and the opportunity to really make a difference to young people's lives. And so there's something about making sure that people in the profession feel valued and feel that they have a value and that they're doing something that is worth it.
Thank you.
No, I think it's incredible that we still have such fantastically high quality staff in colleges, teaching and support staff, given the pay situation. And we're asking, really, as Joe says, lots of them to carry on doing that because, as Bill says, they believe in it and they want to do that. That's just not satisfactory, So I know you said other than pay, but the pay issue is just so fundamental, So put that to one side, but it is the biggest issue that needs to be addressed. Colleges are doing amazing things. I mean, some are moving to four-day working weeks for lecturing staff to allow them to work from home for the fifth day. They're doing all sorts of additional leave and flexibility in terms of employment. They're trying really hard to be fantastic employers, despite the fact that they've just got no money. Workload is a massive issue, So we know that the pressure on staff has increased as well as pay going down. We know that the students themselves are facing so much more pressure. You know, Darren earlier talking about the cost of living crisis and impact. That alone is enough to cause problems. But the mental health issues of students has gone through the roof since the pandemic. And of course, staff aren't immune from that. Mental health issues amongst staff, quite understandably now, are a real concern. So we've got to do much more to support this sector. Pay is absolutely central.
Thank you. And Jo?
In terms of what's fueling a retention and recruitment crisis, pay is number one, but unmanageable workloads and increasingly untenable working conditions. And I'll just give you some of our data. So in our survey, we found that on average, FE staff were working the equivalent of 2 days extra week unpaid. Our members in FE are regularly expected to teach for 28 hours a week and more. This is compared to 21 to 23 hours typical for school teachers, and rocketing class sizes. I mentioned this earlier, but around 19 in our FE colleges versus 11 in sixth forms. So just the burden of work associated with that, supporting those students, doing the prep. This means more marking, more teaching, less time to do all manner of other things. And it's just driving teachers out of the sector. And I think, as has been made clear, without massive remedial public investment, this situation is only going to worsen. But I do just want to add, by returning to this point around collective bargaining, and Bill said, about people feeling valued, you cannot get away from the fact that it's clear you're not valued. You're not being as valued as people, potentially down the road in a sixth form college, teaching the exact same things as you. So we're not getting those pay uplifts. And often, I think when government has relinquished control of properly funding this sector and giving it proper directions as to how to treat people, you're essentially relinquishing control to the worst college principal, who's just trying to balance their budget, and staff isn't the most important thing on how they feel valued and how they turn up to work and whether or not they're leaving the sector within their considerations. So pay, workloads and untenable working conditions, that's what's driving recruitment and retention crisis in FE.
I don't recognise the worst college principal. We did some work with college principals a couple of years ago. Many of them are ashamed at the pay that they're offering to their staff, and it causes immense stress to them that they're doing that. They're not comfortable with it, but they're absolutely backed into a corner. If you haven't got the money, what do? You have to do what you can do, and every single one of my members would be saying they absolutely need more money to pay staff. When we got more money a couple of years ago, about 250 million, all of that money went into the pay award that year. It's really clear that they're committed to better pay. They're just constrained from doing it.
Can I ask, if they have to do what they have to do, why are starting salaries for college lecturers so high but college principal pay so low but college principal pay so high? I just think, as the person representing staff, there are other things colleges could do.
Okay, I've got very little time. I've got one more question and then I'm going to hand back to the chair. What is your assessment of the government's targeted retention incentive payment scheme? And is this a problem because there are fewer opportunities to retain college teachers who are further into their careers? And can I come to David?
Generally getting some money for people in those target sectors to increase their pay for 5 years is a good thing. Definitely causes pressure amongst the ones who aren't getting it, in the non-priority sectors. And it definitely creates some pressure for staff who, after 5 years, then what happens? Because it falls off a cliff edge. So I think it's a classic DFE answer where they said, we've got a little bit of money, let's put it in this way. It helps a bit. But again, it's not a systemic long-term response to what's needed.
I would agree entirely. These hypothecated pots of money for specific projects have a value, but a much greater value is to make sure that the principal is making decisions at a local level, and so put the money on the funding rate. That will allow the principal to... it might be that STEM subjects, for example, aren't a shortage in that particular college, in which case maybe we need to divert the money somewhere else, or we need to spread it evenly. But the local decision is what should count.
Yeah.
It's an acknowledgement that the current system isn't working and that pay isn't enough. It may have beneficial outcomes for that particular subject in a particular college. As has already been acknowledged, I think it has the potential to create quite bad blood amongst colleagues in a college, but it also doesn't get away from the fact that if the workloads and working conditions are untenable, those people are still going to go back to industry where they could make more, presumably working fewer days.
Imran, did you?
Yes, so I think it's too early to evaluate the specifics of this policy because, it was only introduced last year. However, there is some academic evidence which has looked at similar sorts of teacher incentive payments. So the most applicable one is a study looking at the payment made to maths and physics teachers. So this was a £2,000 payment paid to maths and physics teachers in 2019-2020. They actually found that there was a reduction in attrition, about a 23% reduction in attrition in the year that the incentive payment was made. A caveat to that is that it was only looking at that specific year, and there needs to be something more joined up and structured to ensure that retention continues throughout.
Thank you. So finally, I wanted to offer each of you the opportunity to respond to anything that you heard from the previous witnesses in the first panel. Is there anything that you would like to add on qualification pathways, on T-levels, on the attainment gap, or any of the other issues that you might have heard our other witnesses addressing? And we might just work from Joe to Bill in that order.
I think the one thing that I would say on behalf of staff that work in the sector is that the switch from BTECs to T-levels was felt to be really poorly handled. That it increased a huge spike in workload for staff in ways that was quite unmanageable, and that they felt that the switchover wasn't kind of best handled in terms of learners either. So I think staff who work in the sector are always happy and encouraging of us moderating what we offer for students, but that they have to be included in thinking how that will be operationalised, and that doesn't continue to add to what is quite a difficult workload. And I think we did and still do have concerns around the defunding of BTECs and the very important role that they play in bridging a gap between academic and more kind of vocational.
So, this is all about creating viable pathways through FE and skills for young people and adults. And I think there are three key pillars to this. Firstly, qualifications, getting the right qualifications right. That's what we discussed this in the previous session. Secondly, getting the funding correct as well. And thirdly, something which is implicit, which I think has come through in both sessions, is getting communication right as well. And we've seen that communication has been handled quite poorly, I'd say, in terms of both the qualification landscape, so the level 3 qualifications reforms, continual delays in decisions being made, and we've also seen that in the funding system as well. So there are continually delays about when colleges and FE providers hear about funding, and that makes long-term decisions for colleges and other FE providers incredibly difficult. So getting those three things right is crucial.
Yeah, I just want to pick up the pathways bit. We tend to talk about the pathways as if they start at 16. They don't. They start much earlier. So we have a key stage 4 and GCSE system that's really designed to help people do A-levels and then go on to university. It works pretty well, actually. It's not funded particularly well. There's disadvantaged funding that's needed. But for the students who do that and are successful, actually it's not bad. It's the rest of the system that's really falling short. And we think that what we've got to try and do is replicate that in the other side, the sort of 60% who don't go and do A-levels. And I just don't think that's the right way of framing it. We need something in Key Stage 4 that's helping young people get an understanding of technical education. Maybe day release, fully funded to a college to do what I'd call proper technical education. So they get a flavour of it. They're motivated by that. They might do well and better in their GCSEs as a result of it. They get to 16 ready, therefore, to start a full level 3 rather than having to start back at level 2, having to do the resit out of their core programme and being disadvantaged serially because of that. But what we've got to recognise is the world of work is quite diverse. It's not, you cannot boil it down to the 30 or 40 A-levels we have. It's just not possible. There are thousands of jobs. What we need is a simplicity of kind of nomenclature. We need to understand that there are routes that are more technical and there are routes that are more academic, but actually lots of young people want to do a bit of both. You know, there is a mix and match bit here. It's not binary. We shouldn't separate it. And we need to fund the learners who need the learning at the right level. And it's inverse to what it is at the moment. You know, A-level students kind of go through a system that works quite well. They're the ones who actually need less support. The ones who end up in college, 50% of them are doing GCSE English and Maths resits. 50%. It's nearly all of the ones. They're the ones who need the funding. They're the ones who get the least amount of support in 16 to 19 education. And then they get to 18 or 19, the funding reduces. They then become neat, and then we push them onto the youth guarantee that's funded completely separately. We need a much more systemic pathway to get as many young people to level 3 as possible by probably age 21, 22, 23, not by age 18 or 19. We need to completely reframe it.
I would just say I'm not sure that's how we would interpret the different funding levels. We would say that sixth form college students per capita get considerably less than either their school counterparts or college counterparts, and there are very good reasons why general FE colleges and the population of students there get more, but it is a major problem for us. I wouldn't say that the GCSE A-level route is working entirely swimmingly well. I would also say that in agreement with many others today, that this idea of a pathway that is for young people for whom an A-level or a T-level is not appropriate is absolutely indispensable. We've got to have it. We've got a name for it. It's the applied pathway, which is sort of between the two. It makes sense. It's not an alternative pathway to the ones that really matter. It's a pathway in its own right. I went to a college in South London very recently. Their GCSE score of the average score for their 16 to 19 population was 4.4. So 4s and 5s GCSEs was their average grades. The average grade for students doing A-levels now is 6.47. For those doing applied general qualifications, largely BTECs, it's 4.9, and for mixed programs, it's 5.4. So if you're coming into a college with 4s and 5s, you're not going to be able to easily access A-levels. They're not going to be suitable for you, probably. You're not going to be able to access T-levels. The standard is very demanding, and you possibly need to do a resit in at least one of English and Maths, if not both, and there isn't space on the timetable for you to do that. So we absolutely need that applied pathway in the middle, but more than that, we need a pathway that includes big programs for students who don't want to do a T-level, but who do want to major on a particular subject. And at the moment, there are applied general qualifications which are worth 1 A-level, or 2 A-levels, or 3 A-levels. We're confident that the 1 A-level ones will continue to exist. They're absolutely understood and needed. We're very pleased that the government recently has shifted the agenda and is looking more warmly at 2 A-level equivalents, and we think that's a really important development. It would be great if the 3 A-level equivalents were also still available in the future. And the last thing I would say is that we all want T-levels to work. We recognise the contribution that they will make to the qualifications landscape, but tying in the delivery of T-levels to all the conversation that we've had today about funding, I do see that T-level classes at the moment are quite small, and they, on the whole, and they need to be of viable size in order to continue. And what generates viability is either the number of kids or the funding attached to each pupil, each student. So we've got to get that right.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I thank all of our witnesses for coming to give your evidence to us today. It's been incredibly helpful to us. Order. That brings our public evidence session to a close.